and I believe we're going here. I just want to say a few words. I don't want to make this an overly long lecture. I just want to bring some things into context for you about the 1970s, considering where we've come from in this class so far, the end of World War II, where America emerges from that war on this summit of power. We've used that term before. It comes from Winston Churchill. And it's really true. America is unchallenged economically, militarily in the post-war, immediate post-war period. We're the strongest nation on earth. We're 10% of the world's population. We're producing 50% of the world's manufactured goods. We're the China of the 1950s, except we're a middle-class version of it. Americans are going to school. They trust their government. We're building universities and highways. It's not hard to believe that America is the greatest place on earth, but that sense of overwhelming confidence begins to come to an end in the 1970s, so I'm calling it the end of the Great American Ride. And keep in mind that that Great American Ride was just a couple decades long. Before World War II, we were in the midst of the Great Depression, and before that, we didn't all have houses and cars, and we weren't all going to university on GI Bill, and we didn't have our great national highway system and all the things that we're going to develop. We didn't have the gigantic military and all of that stuff. So it's kind of a bubble, really. Maybe the 1970s begin a process whereby the America begins to return to normal. I don't want to disabuse you of your hopefulness that we may, return to that wonderful golden 1950s and where there's abundant jobs and we all live in the suburbs, but probably that's not going to be the case. Maybe the 1970s is really a return to something that's more normal. If you judge it by the standards of today, it might make you feel better that Americans have always and for decades felt a sense of unease and a sense of decline and a sense of lack of confidence and a sense of economic insecurity and a sense of cultural fragmentation and all of these things that we feel today because of our political battles, because of our unstable economy. All of these things people felt in the 1970s as well. So these things are not new either. People felt scared about rising gas prices. They felt scared about their economy and its long-term prospects, etc., etc. So let's talk for a few minutes about the 1970s. Just a few slides to right here look at the pillars. And I talked about this in my text introduction to this module. I said the three pillars of U.S. strength after World War II were our economic system, our military system, and our political system. Okay, well, beginning with the military, our military dominance, unchallenged, unquestioned, and yet in the 1960s we lose a long and controversial war. 60,000 Americans die halfway across the world in the rice paddies of Vietnam, a country that Americans probably hadn't heard of before the beginning of the decade. America's unable to do its will in Vietnam. That calls into question America's dominance in the world. Our government, which Americans in the 1950s, liberal and conservative, frankly, had cohered around many issues, such as the expansion of Social Security, the expansion of our higher education system, and also generally a faith in government. Well, that's all being called into question by Vietnam when it's realized that our leaders lied to us. They lied to us about body counts. They lied to us about the light at the end of the tunnel, which seemed to be always lurking further ahead year after year as the body counts piled up. The Great Society called into question the effectiveness of our government as government programs expanded, and yet seemingly all of our social problems were not solved. Watergate, of course, called into question our government, its ethics, its morality. and we begin to not trust our leaders as a result of these shocks, primarily Vietnam and Watergate, but certainly there's a growing critique of big government programs beginning in the 1960s as conservatives challenge big liberal programs, and these are still parts of the debate that we have today. Our world economic dominance is going to be challenged by emergent economies. Japan and Germany have rebuilt themselves after World War II. The other sort of pillar of our economic dominance in the post-World War II period was cheap and abundant fossil fuel. That's also coming to an end in the 1970s as a series of oil shocks affects the U.S. economy, pushing gas prices up and also helping to create inflation. So the economy of the 1970s, which really makes people feel insecure, is going to be characterized by recessions, inflation, stagflation, which means essentially a combination of those first two things. It means a lack of economic growth, stagnation, tied with inflation, two things that don't usually go together. The OPEC crisis of 1973, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, is going to put an embargo on oil, and it's going to drive prices up. The other thing that's affecting our economy, and by the way, there's another OPEC crisis in 1978. The other thing that's affecting our economy are some long-term structural changes as we move from an industrial to service-based economy with jobs that are no longer as high paying and as stable, and also to a more global economy as well as industrialization moves offshore to lower cost countries, and we begin to lose many of those jobs. So our economy becomes more unstable. You see here shifting from a goods producing to a service producing economy, growing and expanding in these years after the 1960s, 1970s. You see real wages, the value of real wages going down over time. Look at the peak is right about 1970, and then spiking down, lifting up a little bit, and then barreling down this mountain in the 80s again. 1970s characterized by gas lines. I remember these growing up as a kid. Gas lines that wound around the block. Here's inflation being pushed up. There's the first oil shock in the early 70s, the one in 1978. And you can see inflation spiking upward in these years, which makes everything tough. And of course, Watergate coming in the early 1970s, calling into question the ethics and efficacy of our federal government. Here's Richard Nixon sort of fielding questions and fending off reporters. Nixon in his Oval Office with his aides, which were involved in these high crimes and misdemeanors, which would have gotten Nixon evicted from office and impeached had he not resigned first, and was later pardoned by Gerald Ford, his vice president, who becomes president. The impact of Watergate, of course, is it increases the national cynicism about the government, especially the federal government. There's a document in there that you might read and look at. This sense of politics being corrupt, the sense of the federal government spiraling out of control. And so this entire decade you have this sense of national malaise, which means a kind of illness, sickness, insecurity, a crisis of confidence. And getting to the end of the decade, you have Jimmy Carter and his policies, which don't seemingly help things on a foreign policy level or a domestic level. And of course, the speech I've had you read about the national crisis of confidence evokes all of these different things, the post-Watergate, post-Vietnam era. Add into that a growing sense of fragmentation within the culture with regard to battles over things like gay rights. These are still issues today. Sexual preference. I think that's even a controversial concept to say that it's a preference rather than an orientation that we are born with. But these are parts of the debate that still go on today. And of course, today we're always battling over gay marriage and things like that. But this sense of a culture which in the 1950s Americans said was cohesive, well, it's no longer as cohesive anymore. Even things like the Equal Rights Amendment becomes controversial in the 1970s. It doesn't seem like a controversial proposal to put this in the Constitution. Read it. This is it. I mean, this is the provision right here. This is all it is. Equal rights. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's it. Doesn't seem that controversial. Indeed, it passes through most of the states immediately in 1972, 73. But then it's going to meet a backlash, and we're going to see that a anti-feminist Stop ERA movement is going to emerge on the scene, led by Phyllis Schlafly, whose article I had you read, or a portion of her writing I had you read for this week as well. And Schlafly and other sort of anti-feminists from the 1970s begin to call into question the discourse of equality, wondering if women are going to lose something in the bargain. And as well, the women's rights movement is going to become increasingly associated then with reproductive rights, which is also going to be controversial, especially after the Supreme Court's decision Roe v. Wade in 1973. So basically, what I just want to say to you then is you should recognize there are all of these things tugging on Americans at the and throughout this decade in the 1970s, and leading towards this overall crisis of confidence, economic, political, military, social, and cultural reasons. So keep all of this in mind. Enjoy your discussion this week, and good luck to you.